Have you ever stopped, truly stopped, in the middle of your day and asked yourself what you are actually doing with your life? Because somewhere between the routine and the excuses and the endless waiting for the right moment, you forgot that time is not pausing for you, that the clock on the wall does not care about your fears, that the world keeps moving whether you are ready or not. And the most dangerous thing you can do right now is nothing, absolutely nothing, while your potential sits inside you like a fire that nobody ever lit. That question is uncomfortable, and it is supposed to be, because comfort is exactly what is keeping you small. Welcome to English to Inspire, the place where you learn English and rebuild yourself at the same time, where every word you understand is a step forward in your language and in your life, where the story of someone who once stood at the edge of greatness and jumped becomes the story that pushes you to jump too. And if this channel is giving you something real, something that makes you feel the fire, then subscribe right now. Because what is coming will change the way you see yourself and the world around you. Today we are talking about Howard Hughes, a name that carries the weight of genius and madness and courage and tragedy all at once. A man who built airplanes and film studios and billion-dollar empires, not because the world asked him to, but because something inside him refused to accept the ordinary, refused to sit still, refused to believe that the life he was given was the limit of the life he could create. And the first thing you need to understand about Howard Hughes is that he did not start from nothing. He started from pain. And pain, when you learn to use it, becomes the most powerful engine a human being can have. He was born in 1905 in Humble, Texas, into a family of money and ambition. His father, a man who invented a revolutionary oil drill bit and built a fortune from the ground up. And young Howard grew up watching what focused obsession could produce, watching what happened when a man refused to accept the limits that others placed around him. And something in that boy absorbed every lesson silently and deeply, storing it all like fuel in a tank, waiting for the moment when he would finally be free to ignite. And that moment came far too early and far too painfully, because by the time Howard was 18 years old, both of his parents were gone, and he was standing alone in the world with a fortune in one hand and an emptiness in the other. Most people would have let that grief swallow them. Most people would have retreated into safety and comfort, spending what their parents left and living a quiet life that no one would ever remember. But Howard Hughes was not most people, and that is exactly the point. Because what separates the ones who rise from the ones who disappear is never the absence of pain. It is always the decision about what to do with it. And Howard made his decision fast, with the kind of cold, burning clarity that only loss can produce, and the world would never be the same because of it. When Howard Hughes took control of his father's company at 18 years old, he did not call a board meeting and ask experienced men what he should do. He did not surround himself with advisors who would tell him to be careful and go slow and wait until he was older and wiser. He did not hesitate. He moved, because hesitation was a language he never learned to speak, and that single quality, that refusal to wait for permission, would define every chapter of his life from that moment forward. And the first lesson that Howard Hughes is teaching you right now, today, is that nobody is going to give you a signal. Nobody is going to tap you on the shoulder and say that now is the right time, because that moment never comes unless you decide it has come. He bought out the other shareholders of the Hughes Tool Company with his inheritance and took full control before most young men his age had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. And then he did something that seemed completely irrational to everyone around him. He turned his attention away from the profitable and stable oil business that his father had built and pointed himself toward Hollywood, toward the chaotic and expensive and wildly unpredictable world of motion pictures. Because Howard Hughes did not chase safety. He chased the thing that made his blood move faster, the thing that scared him a little, the thing that everyone else said was too risky and too ambitious and too far beyond what a young man from Texas had any right to attempt. He produced films that broke records and shocked audiences. He demanded perfection on every set. He spent money that made his accountants physically ill with worry, and he did not care. Because Howard Hughes understood something that most people spend their entire lives never understanding. which is that the size of your output is directly connected to the size of your investment. And if you are only willing to give a little, you will only ever receive a little in return. And if you want something that has never been done before, you have to be willing to pay a price that nobody has paid before. And that willingness to pay, to truly pay, in time and energy and risk, is what separates the dreamer who stays dreaming from the builder who actually builds. But Hollywood was only half of the fire burning inside him, because at the same time that he was conquering the film world, Howard Hughes was falling deeply and completely in love with the sky, with aviation, with the raw mechanical miracle of a machine that could lift a human body off the ground and carry it through clouds at speeds that made the heart stop. And he did not approach aviation the way a businessman would. He did not look at it as an investment or an opportunity. He looked at it the way a child looks at something magnificent and thinks, I need to be part of that. I need to touch that. I need to push that as far as it will go. He learned to fly with the same obsessive intensity he brought to everything else, spending hours in the cockpit, studying engineering, surrounding himself with the best mechanics and designers he could find. And then he started racing. And then he started breaking records. And the world started to notice that this young man from Texas was not playing games. He was not a rich hobbyist with a dangerous toy. He was something altogether different. He was someone who looked at the limit and felt not fear but hunger. And that hunger was about to take him higher than anyone had ever gone before. There is a moment in every great person's life when the world stops dismissing them and starts watching them. When the whispers of who does he think he is slowly transform into a silence that is full of awe and disbelief and a grudging, burning respect. And for Howard Hughes, that moment came at full speed. Literally. Because in 1935 he climbed into a plane that he had helped design and engineered himself and set a new world airspeed record, flying at over 300 miles per hour across the California desert, and the people who had called him reckless and irresponsible and dangerously obsessed suddenly had nothing left to say, because the scoreboard does not lie, and results have a way of ending every argument. But he did not stop there, because stopping was the one thing Howard Hughes was constitutionally incapable of doing. And in 1937 he flew from Los Angeles to New York in 7 hours and 28 minutes, shattering the previous record, and proving that his obsession with speed and engineering was not vanity, but vision. And then in 1938 he did something that the entire world watched with open mouths. He flew around the entire globe in just under 4 days, a journey of nearly 15,000 miles, completing it faster than anyone had ever done before, landing back in New York to a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people who lined the streets to see this man who had wrapped his arms around the planet and squeezed. Now stop for a moment and think about what that actually means. Because Howard Hughes was not an astronaut with government funding and a team of thousands. He was a private individual who decided that a thing was possible and then made it possible through will and preparation, and an absolute refusal to accept the version of reality that other people were comfortable with. And the question you need to ask yourself right now is, what version of reality are you accepting that you should be refusing? What limit have you drawn around your own life, not because it is real, but because someone told you it was there, and you believed them without ever testing it yourself? At the same time, his film career was reaching its own kind of altitude, because Hughes was producing work in Hollywood that pushed boundaries in ways that made censors uncomfortable and audiences hungry for more. And he fought the studios and the authorities and the critics with the same energy he brought to fighting air, resistance, and gravity. Because to Howard Hughes, the enemy was always the same regardless of the arena. The enemy was the ceiling. The invisible ceiling that society places above every individual that says this, far and no further. And every time he hit that ceiling, he did not pull back. He accelerated, and the ceiling broke. This is the chapter of Howard Hughes's life that most people want to live in. The victories, and the records, and the roaring crowds. And it is right that you feel inspired by it, but you need to understand that this chapter was not built on talent alone. It was built on a foundation of failures and embarrassments, and near disasters that the history books mention briefly, but that Howard felt completely and physically and personally. And the real lesson of these years is not that he was exceptional. The real lesson is that he was relentless. And relentless is a decision. It is a choice you make every single morning when you open your eyes and the world asks you what you are going to do today. Nobody talks enough about the crashes. And there were crashes. Real ones. Violent and metal-tearing and life-threatening crashes that would have ended most people's relationship with the sky forever. Because when a human body goes through the kind of physical trauma that Howard Hughes experienced inside broken cockpits and burning wreckage, the natural response of every nerve and muscle and survival instinct is to say never again. To say that the dream is not worth the destruction. To say that it is time to find something safer and smaller and less likely to kill you. And the fact that Howard Hughes heard all of that and kept going is not something you should admire from a distance. It is something you should study up close. Because that same voice that told him to stop is the same voice that is talking to you right now. In 1943, he crashed a flying boat prototype into Lake Mead, and he survived. And he kept building. And then in 1945, he crashed an experimental military reconnaissance plane into a Beverly Hills neighborhood, tearing through 3 houses and leaving him with a crushed collarbone, 6 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and third-degree burns across significant portions of his body. And the doctors who worked on him that night were not certain he would survive. And the ones who believed he might survive were not certain he would ever fully recover. And Howard Hughes lay in that hospital bed broken and burned and breathing with 1 lung and made the decision, somewhere in the pain and the medication and the darkness, that he was not finished. That the story did not end here. That there was still too much left to build. You need to sit with that image for a moment, because it is easy to say that you believe in your dream when life is going well, when the momentum is with you, and the results are coming, and the people around you are impressed. But the real test of what you believe is what you do when you are lying flat on your back with broken bones and a body that has been punished for daring to try. And the question is not whether you will ever crash, because you will. The question is what you will decide in the moment. When the crash is over and the dust has settled and you have to choose between staying down and getting back up. And Howard Hughes answered that question with his actions, not once, but multiple times throughout his life. He came back from that 1945 crash and threw himself back into his work with an intensity that frightened the people around him. Because pain had not slowed him down. It had focused him. It had stripped away everything that was not essential and left only the core of what he was, which was a man with a vision and an engine inside him that nobody and nothing could permanently shut off. And he began pushing Hughes Aircraft into territory that would eventually produce technology used by the United States military for decades. And he fought to keep control of TWA, his airline, against bankers and board members and government officials who wanted a piece of what he had built and believed they deserved to run it better than he could. The pain was not just physical either, because Howard Hughes carried emotional wounds that never fully healed, wounds from the early loss of his parents, wounds from relationships that his obsession made impossible to sustain, wounds from a mind that never rested and never forgave itself for imperfection. And the dangerous truth about a person who is driven by that kind of internal fire is that the same intensity that produces greatness also produces suffering. And Hughes was living proof of both at the same time, burning so brightly that everyone around him could see the light but could also feel the heat. And the world was about to test him in ways that went far beyond broken bones and burning wreckage. There is a kind of person in this world who is not satisfied with being great at one thing, who looks at an empire they have already built and feels not pride, but restlessness, not completion, but a new hunger that points in a completely different direction. And Howard Hughes was that kind of person in the most extreme and total way imaginable. Because while he was breaking aviation records and producing films that shocked Hollywood, he was also thinking about systems and structures and the invisible architecture of power that holds industries together, and he began to understand that the real game, the game that most people never even see, is not about being the best pilot or the best filmmaker. It is about owning the machine that makes everything else possible. He had inherited a tool company that produced drill bits used in oil extraction all over the world, and while others might have seen that as a foundation to protect and preserve carefully, Hughes saw it as an engine to fuel something much larger, and he used the steady river of income that the Hughes Tool Company generated to fund ventures that no rational banker would have approved, pouring money into aviation research and aircraft development, and eventually into the formation of Hughes Aircraft Company, which would grow into one of the most important defense contractors in the history of the United States, producing radar systems and satellites and weapons technology that shaped the outcome of conflicts and the direction of an entire nation's military power. Then there was TWA, Trans World Airlines, which Hughes acquired and transformed into a symbol of ambition and modernity. Because Hughes did not look at an airline the way a businessman looks at a transportation company. He looked at it the way a visionary looks at the future, understanding that the world was about to become connected by air in ways that would change commerce and culture and human relationships permanently. And he wanted to be the man who built those connections, who designed those routes, who put those planes in the sky. And for a time he was exactly that man, fighting every obstacle and every rival and every board member who tried to dilute his vision with compromise and caution and the suffocating logic of short-term thinking. Think about what you are doing with the resources you have right now. Because Howard Hughes did not wait until he had more money or more time or more support before he started building. He used what was in his hands, and he stretched it further than anyone thought it could go. And the lesson is not that you need to be a billionaire to build something that matters. The lesson is that you need to stop looking at what you have and seeing limitations. You need to start looking at what you have and seeing fuel. Because fuel is exactly what it is, and the only question is whether you have the courage and the vision to light the match and let it burn. His empire was not built cleanly or quietly or without conflict, because Hughes made enemies the way fire makes smoke, naturally and constantly, and as a direct result of burning so intensely. And the politicians and the rivals and the corporate interests that circled him were not simply jealous, they were threatened. Because a man who refuses to follow the rules of the game is dangerous to everyone who has built their power on those rules staying exactly as they are. And the storm that was coming for Howard Hughes was not a personal failure or a random misfortune. It was the inevitable collision between a force that could not be contained and a world that very badly wanted to contain it. There are moments in history when one man stands in a room full of people who have decided he is finished. People with titles and suits and the full weight of institutional power behind them. People who have prepared their arguments and aligned their allies and convinced themselves that this time, finally, this impossible and exhausting and infuriating man will be brought down to a size they can manage. And Howard Hughes walked into exactly that room in 1947 when the United States Senate called him to testify before a congressional investigation that was designed from the very beginning not to find the truth, but to destroy him. And what happened in that room is one of the most extraordinary displays of individual courage against institutional power that the 20th century produced. The investigation was led by Senator Owen Brewster, a man with deep connections to Hughes's rivals in the airline industry, a man who wanted to force a merger between TWA and Pan American Airways that would have effectively ended Hughes's control of his own airline. And Brewster used the power of the Senate to paint Hughes as a war prophet, accusing him of taking government money for military aircraft contracts and delivering nothing of value in return. And the cameras were there, and the newspapers were ready, and the narrative was already written. And the narrative said that Howard Hughes was a fraud, a reckless rich man who had wasted public money and deserved to be humiliated in front of the entire nation. But Howard Hughes did not arrive at those hearings broken or defensive or ready to apologize. He arrived prepared, focused, and furious in the most controlled and deliberate way possible. And he turned the entire proceeding around by going on the offensive, accusing Brewster directly of corruption and collusion and of using the power of the Senate to serve the private business interests of his allies. And he did it with such clarity and such force and such detailed knowledge of the facts that the room shifted, that the senators who had arrived expecting to watch an execution found themselves watching something else entirely. And the something else was a man who refused to be a victim even when the entire machinery of government was pointed at his chest. This is the moment in Howard Hughes's life that you need to burn into your memory. Not the records, and not the films, and not the billion-dollar empire, but this moment, because this is the moment that tells you who he really was. At the core, and the question it asks you is, what do you do when the system turns against you? What do you do when the people with the power and the platform decide that you are the problem and begin to build a case against everything you have worked for? Because that moment will come for you in some form. Maybe not in a Senate hearing room, but in an office or a relationship or a community. And the answer that Howard Hughes gave is the only answer that works, which is that you stand up, you speak the truth, and you do not apologize for existing. The spruce goose, the enormous flying boat that critics called a fantasy and a waste and a monument to one man's ego, became the other symbol of this period, because Hughes had promised the government a fleet of massive transport aircraft and delivered instead a single prototype that his enemies used as evidence of his incompetence. But when Hughes climbed into that plane on November 2nd, 1947, in front of reporters who had gathered to watch him fail, and lifted it off the water for a flight of about 1 mile at an altitude of 70 feet, he was not proving that the plane was commercially viable. He was proving something much more important. He was proving that when Howard Hughes said a thing was possible, it was possible, and that the people who had gathered to celebrate his humiliation had miscalculated, again, the same way they always did. There is a line that exists in every human life, a line so thin and so invisible that most people cross it without ever knowing it was there. And on one side of that line is passion. The kind of burning, focused passion that builds empires and breaks records and makes the impossible real. And on the other side of that line is something darker. Something that looks exactly like passion from the outside, but feels like a prison from the inside. And Howard Hughes crossed that line somewhere in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly and quietly and in ways that the people closest to him began to notice before he ever noticed it himself. And the story of how that crossing happened is not a story about weakness. It is a story about what happens when a human being never learns to stop. The obsessive quality that had made him unstoppable was the same quality that began to unmake him, because the mind that could not tolerate imperfection in an aircraft design could not tolerate it anywhere else either. And Hughes began to develop rituals and compulsions around cleanliness and contamination that started as quirks and grew into chains. And the man who had once moved through the world with the confidence of someone who believed he could control everything began to retreat from a world that he increasingly experienced as threatening and dirty and impossible to make safe enough. And the cruel irony is that the very drive for control that had given him so much power over his external world was now turning inward and consuming him from the inside. You need to hear this part of the story, not because it is dark, but because it is true. And the truth is that greatness without balance is not sustainable, that a life built entirely on drive and output, and the relentless pursuit of the next achievement, with no space for rest or connection or the simple human experience of being still and being enough, is a life that will eventually turn on itself. And Howard Hughes is one of the most powerful examples in history of what happens when a person treats themselves as a machine rather than a human being. When they pour everything into the dream and leave nothing for the person who is dreaming it, his relationships deteriorated, his physical health declined, and the mental illness that had been growing quietly in the background began to demand more and more of his attention and his energy. And the people who worked for him adapted to his increasingly difficult demands out of loyalty and fear, and the genuine belief that the genius was still in there somewhere underneath the illness. And they were right. The genius was still there. It never left. But genius trapped inside a suffering mind is not free to do what it was born to do. And Hughes began to disappear from public life in a way that seemed impossible for a man who had once been the most watched and most talked about individual in America. The lesson here is not that you should be afraid of your ambition or that you should pull back from your dreams to protect yourself. The lesson is that you are not just a vehicle for your goals. You are a human being with a body that needs rest and a mind that needs peace and a heart that needs connection. And the strongest version of you is not the version that burns the hottest for the shortest time. It is the version that learns to manage the fire, to feed it carefully and consistently, to know when to push and when to breathe. Because Howard Hughes never learned that, and the cost of not learning it was everything. And you are watching his life right now, so that you do not have to pay that same cost yourself. Picture a man who once stood in the center of the world, who had flown faster than any human alive, who had sat in Senate hearing rooms and stared down the most powerful politicians in America without blinking, who had built companies that shaped the future of aviation and defense and entertainment. And now picture that same man alone in a darkened hotel room with the curtains drawn tight against the light, surrounded by tissues and empty bottles and the remnants of meals he barely touched, giving instructions to assistants through notes slipped under doors because the thought of direct human contact had become unbearable to him. And ask yourself how a human being travels from one of those images to the other. Because that journey is one of the most important and most painful lessons that Howard Hughes has to teach you. He moved from hotel to hotel in his final years, from Las Vegas to the Bahamas, to Nicaragua, to London, to Acapulco, always in the penthouse, always with the windows sealed and the rooms kept at specific temperatures and every object in his environment handled according to rituals that had grown so complex and so demanding that the small team of aides who manage his daily existence had to memorize. Procedures that would have seemed incomprehensible to any outside observer. And the man who had once moved through the world at full speed was now essentially stationary, existing in a controlled bubble that grew smaller and more suffocating with every passing year. And the outside world caught only rumors and glimpses and occasional photographs that shocked people who remembered what Howard Hughes had once been. Now stop and be honest with yourself. Because isolation is not something that only happens to billionaires with mental illness. Isolation is something that happens quietly and gradually to ordinary people every single day. It happens when you stop reaching out because you have been hurt too many times. It happens when you retreat into your work or your phone or your habits because the world outside feels too complicated and too demanding and too full of variables you cannot control. And the distance between Howard Hughes sealed in his penthouse and a person sealed inside their own private world of avoidance and routine is smaller than you want to believe. And recognizing that distance is the first step toward making sure you never close it completely. His physical deterioration in those final years was severe, because a body that is not properly nourished and not exposed to sunlight and not engaged in movement begins to break down in ways that no amount of money can reverse. And Hughes, who had access to the best medical care in the world, refused most of it because the very thought of doctors and needles and physical contact had become entangled in his fears. And the man who had survived multiple plane crashes and come back stronger was being undone, not by any external force, but by the internal world he had built around himself, brick by brick, year by year, until the walls were too thick for light to get through. But here is what you must never forget about these shadow years. Because it would be easy to look at this period and see only tragedy and waste and the collapse of something that was once magnificent. But the truth is more complicated and more instructive than that. Because even in those dark hotel rooms, even in the grip of an illness that had stolen so much from him, Howard Hughes was still making decisions that affected industries and governments and thousands of lives, still signing documents and directing strategies and influencing the direction of companies that were shaping the modern world. And the lesson is not that the darkness won. The lesson is that even when the darkness is real and heavy and closing in, the human capacity to contribute and to matter does not simply disappear. And you carry that same capacity inside you right now, no matter what room you are sitting in or what walls you have built around yourself. When Howard Hughes died on April 5, 1976, aboard an aircraft flying from Mexico to Houston, the man who had spent his life conquering the sky took his final journey through it, and the world that received the news was a world that had almost forgotten he was still alive. Because the public Howard Hughes had disappeared so completely behind the walls of his final years that his death felt too many people like the closing of a chapter that had already ended long ago. And yet the truth was the opposite of that, because the things that Howard Hughes had built and pioneered and fought for were not only still alive, they were woven into the fabric of modern life in ways that most people experienced every single day, without ever knowing his name was behind them. Hughes Aircraft Company. The organization he had built from his passion for aviation and technology had by the time of his death become one of the most important defense and aerospace contractors in the United States, producing radar systems and satellites and electronic guidance technology that defined the capabilities of the American military for generations. And the engineers and scientists who worked within that organization carried forward a culture of technical ambition and relentless innovation that Hughes himself had instilled through his own example, through his refusal to accept that the current version of anything was good enough, through his belief that the gap between what exists and what is possible is always smaller than the experts claim. The airline industry that he had helped shape through his ownership and development of TWA carried millions of people across continents and oceans on routes and in aircraft that reflected the vision he had poured into aviation decades earlier. And the films he produced in Hollywood had pushed the boundaries of what cinema could say and show and feel in ways that influenced generations of filmmakers who came after him. And the legal and regulatory battles he fought against government overreach and corporate monopoly created precedents and established principles that protected the rights of individual entrepreneurs against institutional power long after the specific controversies that generated them had been forgotten. Think about the people in your own life whose influence you carry without always being aware of it. The teacher who said one thing that changed the direction of your thinking. The parent or mentor who modeled a quality that you absorbed and made your own. The stranger whose story reached you at exactly the right moment and planted a seed that is still growing. Because legacy is not always a statue or a building with your name on it. Legacy is the invisible transfer of energy from one human life to the lives that are touched by it. And Howard Hughes transferred an enormous amount of energy into the world. Energy that kept moving and kept building long after the man himself had retreated from view. His life is a mirror, and what you see in it depends entirely on where you choose to point it. Because if you point it at the darkness, you will see a cautionary tale about obsession and isolation and the cost of never learning balance. And that reflection is true and important and worth studying carefully. But if you point it at the light, you will see something equally true and equally important. You will see a human being who decided at 18 years old that the life he had been handed was only the starting point and not the destination, who looked at a world full of limits and felt not despair but hunger, who crashed and burned and broke and came back, who fought systems that were designed to crush him and made them flinch instead, and who left behind a world that was measurably different and measurably more advanced because he had lived in it. And now the mirror is turning, and it is pointing at you. The mirror is pointing at you right now, and it is not going to look away, because everything you have heard in this journey through Howard Hughes's life was never really about Howard Hughes. It was always about you. It was always about the version of you that exists right now in this moment, sitting with this voice in your ears, and a life in your hands that is either growing or shrinking, either moving or standing still, because there is no neutral in the human experience. There is no comfortable middle ground where you can pause time and take a break from the responsibility of becoming who you are supposed to be. And the clock that did not care about your fears at the beginning of this story still does not care about them now. And it never will. You heard about a boy who lost everything that was supposed to protect him before he was old enough to vote and decided that loss would be his fuel and not his excuse. And you heard about a man who climbed into machines that could kill him and pointed them at the sky, because the alternative, the safe and quiet and forgettable alternative, was a kind of death that he refused to accept. And you heard about someone who stood in rooms full of power and did not flinch, who crashed and came back, who built empires from obsession and paid the price of never learning to rest. And all of that, every single piece of that story, was a language lesson and a life lesson delivered at the same time. Because that is what this channel exists to give you. English and fire together. Words and the will to use them. So now the question is brutally simple, and it deserves a brutally honest answer, which is, what are you going to do with what you have just received? Because information without action is just noise, and inspiration without movement is just emotion that fades by tomorrow morning. And the difference between the people who listen to a story like this and feel something and then go back to exactly the life they were living before, and the people who listen to a story like this and use it as the moment everything changed. That difference is not talent, and it is not luck, and it is not circumstance. That difference is a decision. One single decision made in one single moment. And that moment is right now, not tomorrow, not after the next obstacle clears, not when conditions improve, right now. Howard Hughes did not wait for the world to be ready for him. He arrived before the world was ready and forced it to catch up. And the price he paid for living that way was real, and it was heavy, and you have heard it in full. But the price of not living that way, the price of choosing safety over hunger and comfort over growth and the opinion of others over the call of your own vision, that price is paid quietly and invisibly in a currency called regret. And regret is the heaviest thing a human being can carry, because unlike broken bones, it never fully heals, and unlike a crashed plane, it leaves no visible wreckage. Just a slow and private awareness that you had more inside you than you ever let out. Your life is the plane and you are the pilot, and the runway is right in front of you, and everything you have learned and felt and absorbed in this journey is fuel in the tank. And the only question that remains, the only question that has ever really mattered, is whether you are going to sit on that runway until the fuel runs out, or whether you are going to push the throttle forward and find out exactly how high you can go. Because the sky does not have a ceiling. It never did. Howard Hughes proved that. And now it is your turn to prove it too. So do not wait. Do not hesitate. Do not let another day pass as evidence against the person you were born to be. The world is ready for you. The only question is whether you are ready for the world.